It's got, there's a bunch of switches built into one, and it's still proving out the brake light, and it's got it so that the blower won't work. And like the accessories, you know how it turns off the blower and the radio and all this stuff when you're in start? If the switch sticks just past the start position, it'll do that. Anyway, if you see, you know, if you hear one doing that, if you grab it and turn it back a little bit till it's in the on position and all that stuff starts working, the ignition switch, the electrical part's got to be replaced. When you turn the ignition switch on, the brake light on the light with the park brake off, the ABS indicator lamp should light a few seconds and then go out. Okay, you apply and release the parking brake. The brake lamp should light when the parking brake's applied and go out when you release it. And this is what you're going to do when you're checking this system to make sure it's working right. The ABS indicator lamp should light while the engine is cranking and go out when it starts. That's what it goes. If you're prove out of that bulb that I was talking about, on some systems it might remain on for just a second after the engine starts and goes out. You're going to check the operation of the stop lamps by mashing the brake pedal while in the system. And you know what the CHMSL is? Remember this? CHMSL. Remember what that is? You got to make sure that works. Have you ever seen one that the CHMSL didn't work on? You never have. Nobody can remember what center high mount stop lamp?
Oh yeah.
If the center high mount stop light works, but the ones down here don't, what do you think is going on there? No, we got a turn signal switch usually. See that? Now that's if you've got have you got that problem with yours? Center high mount stop light works, but the other ones don't. If they're the ones that double as the turn signals, then you need to put a turn signal. And if you got orange turn signals, there's going to be something else. In other words, orange turn signals aren't hooked up to the brake light. I mean, to with the brake light. All right. So you're going to check the operation of the stop lamp. Make sure that and the center high mount stop light. Make sure they light when the pedals are flat and they go off when it's released. You don't want them staying on all the time. With the engine running, you're going to pump the brake pedal rapidly. The pedal height ought to remain about the same. If it increases during pumping, or you notice it getting spongy, you may have air in there. You know, of course, usually you're going to feel it spongy right to start with. So it's common for the brake pedal on a car with anti-lock brakes to feel slightly softer than a car without anti-lock brakes. Did you know that? Anybody know that? You can force the pedal to the floor with firm pressure on some of them, and it's important to check for the uniformity or repeatability of the brake pedal operation. If it feels different every time you mash it, you got issues. It ought to remain constant as you're applying and release the pedal. If they change with repeated pedal applications, you might have some air in there. If it's got vacuum-assisted brakes, you know how to check that. The booster. How do you check to make sure the booster's good? How about Archie? Remember? All right, you got your foot on the brake. Car's been sitting there. Got your foot on the brake. You know, you tap the brake a few times. Make sure there ain't no vacuum still trapped in there. And fire it up. And if you feel the brake pedal go down, you know the booster's working.
Oh yeah.
That ain't complicated, is it? Put your foot on the brake. Fire up the engine. When the engine starts, you'll feel the pedal go down. If you don't feel the pedal go down, all you got to do to see what it feels like when you ain't got, unplug the vacuum line from the booster and, you know, put a piece of tape over or something and have somebody to check it. You know, put your foot on the brake, you know, you're going to have some stuff there. So keep that in mind. If you got any interruption of the vacuum supply to the booster, it don't always mean you got a bad booster. If you think you got a bad booster, what you do first, you're going to check, make sure you got good, strong hurricane vacuum in one of your boosters. You know, like that on, like saying on your PCU valve. If it's got, what you're going to supposed to, okay, with a vacuum reserve, there's a vacuum reserve in that booster. Well, you're going to shut off the engine, check your master cylinder fluid level. I always look at that first. But on late model cars, that can be done by cleaning the translucent reservoir. Sometimes they'll be dirty. And noting the fluid level in relation to the embossed line or mark that says max. And you're supposed to remove the fluid, the reservoir cap, and do what? How can you tell if the fluid needs to be replaced?
There.
You know, I used to work at a Volkswagen dealer, and one of the things they wanted us to do periodically was replace the brake fluid. And basically what they wanted you to do is open all the bleeders and keep pumping it through until you, now it's not like bleeding the brakes, although you are loosening all the bleeders, but you put your hose into the bottle going down under the, you know, like we do when we're bleeding them.
Right.
You put the hose into the bottle where the tip of it is under some existing brake fluid, and you just keep on pumping until the fluid coming out is clear. And I used, back in years ago, Delco had something called D-Clean that looked like purple denatured alcohol, and that was to flush brake systems with. If you flush a brake system with something like that now, denatured alcohol or something like that, and you use denatured alcohol if you're ever going to fool with anything thinking. It won't attack rubber. And you can get it from the parts house. You know, it's used for paint thinner and something. But anyway, so I actually, on these Chevrolet pickups out here, I flushed the brake system because they were so filthy with denatured alcohol, and it caused some stuff to break loose and stop the lock some valves in their closed position in the ABS unit, and then when you hit the brake, the rear brakes wouldn't release. And so I had to replace that hydraulic control unit. But I will tell you this, you won't typically have that problem if you flush it through with clean fluid. Make sure you're using good fluid. There was a student of mine that bought some fluid for his own car from the dollar store. And he just, can of brake fluid, it's brake fluid, I bought it from the dollar store. And when he poured it in his master cylinder, he noticed that it caused the gasket on the master cylinder cap to swell up. It had oil in it. Is that a problem? You see a swelled up rubber cover on the master cylinder, somebody put some oil in there. And JT fouled up and accidentally poured power steering fluid in the master cylinder on my Hyundai. Wow. Out here, he caught it before we mashed the brake or anything. He sucked it back out of there and all. But that was, pretty silly. And he came to us, man, I feel really stupid. I put, but you got to be thinking clearly and paying attention to what you're doing. All right, so you're going to pull the cap. Remember we talked about measuring the voltage in the reservoir. Mm-hmm. 0.3 of a volt means there's water. That's not really all that great of a way of doing that. Those little Phoenix Systems dip strips that turn purple when they got too much copper in there, that's really a good way to check that. Okay. You got to make sure your vacuum hose is good between there. You got to look at all your brake lines, hoses, and fittings. And you remember what I told you about these brake lines? I got to make sure you guys remember this now. Making these coils, they actually come out of the master cylinder, and they make these coily, and then they go down. Have you ever seen that? Yeah. And typically I've never heard anybody talk about that, but I kind of figured out. And sometimes they'll have a little wire wrapped around them. Look like a spring. And my contention is you only see that when the brake lines are running close to the manifold.
That's the one that's so hot.
So it keeps it cool. Yeah, it helps it to stay cool. That's my contention. Now, I actually mentioned that in an article that I wrote about heat transfer for Motor Age magazine, and nobody challenged me on that. So usually if I came up with that, so that's got to be the reason they're doing that, because what other reason would they have other than the fact? See, the master cylinder, usually when they got something that will take a little movement, the master cylinder is actually going to be mounted to the car body. Where are the brake lines going? Yeah. They're going to the frame, right? Now, does the frame and the car body move separately a lot? Not really. On most of them nowadays, you got unibody. On your Crown Vicky, you got rubber mounts on the body, but they don't move all that much. You see what I'm saying? But basically, they're worried. My contention was there may be a little movement there because of body mounts, but I'm saying that they're doing that so that it will keep the brake fluid from boiling. If your brake fluid boils, you have all of a sudden no brakes because you're squeezing air, right? All right. Now let's troubleshoot with the brake pedal, right? You can determine the probable cause of a bunch of brake system problems by identifying different symptoms when you apply the brakes. Okay, if you got a pedal surge, brake chatter, or vehicle surge during braking, what you got? You got front disc out of round, excessive disc thickness variation, bearings out of adjustment. Now, when I say bearings out of adjustment, the ones that we pull out and pack. Yeah. If somebody leaves those nuts too loose and that rotor's able to move, as the rotor's able to move, it will actually push the piston back up in the caliper. It'll push the piston back up in the caliper. And you know how when you've just done a disc brake job and you're backing out of the shop, some yo-yos will not even think about mashing the brake pedal a few times to make sure they're pushed out. And the first time they hit the brake, they ain't hardly got no brake. When you just got through putting brake pads on it, scare the tar out of you. You're like, oh no, you got to hit them again. So, but anyway, this thing, when those rotors are moving because of the bearings, and I'm talking about the ones where you pull the little cap off and you pull the cotter key in the nut and you pull them apart and pack them. You can make those loose so that rotor's moving around, and it's going to cause you to have that problem right there.
That's why you got to tighten your hand tight.
Tighten it all the way up and spin it. And then, I wouldn't don't tighten it too much or you'll, cause issues with the bearing. but they don't need to be moving around either. If the brakes grab, let me tell you about a little brake story I had over there when I was working at Mazda. There was a GLC that was nearly a brand new car, and I don't have any miles on it. And this thing here, when you would hit the brakes, it would lock up the rear wheel, just slide the wheels. Just touch the brake now. I'm talking about I'm driving along and I'm just going to touch a brake and it had drum brakes on the back. It would slide the wheels. And so I pulled up. It wasn't quite so bad hot as it was cold. So I pulled the brake drums off and the shoes looked brand new. I mean, I didn't see a problem with it. All the springs were in there like they're supposed to be. They were adjusted right. So I just took me some brake parts cleaner and I cleaned those shoes, washed them real good. Got them nice and cleaned off and blew them dry and all that with a brake parts cleaner, and put them all back together and all that stuff went away. But what it was on those particular shoes, and you may not ever run into this, if they put some resin in there that will squeeze, it will weep through that lining and make it a little bit sticky when it's cold, it'll cause them to slide like that. So a lot of times you can just clean the brake shoes real. I'm not talking about taking them off the car, or if you wanted to, pop the thing apart and hit them real hard with a steam cleaner, good hot water, that would help too. But brake parts cleaner will typically take care of that. And there's other reasons they can do that, but on that particular car it's like that. There's another job I told you about where this lady came in on another GLC that was, it didn't really feel like, the pulsing brakes you usually feel. It was different. It was a real strange feel. And that's when I pulled the brake calipers off, I pulled the wheel off, and I noticed there was a rust spot that was shaped exactly like the pads. And apparently she had went through a puddle, splashed the brakes, got them wet, parked the car, took a trip for a couple of weeks. And there was water trapped between the brake pad and the rotor. Yeah. And it rusted it right there in that one spot. And so I took the car and I raised it up, and I got my drill, and I put a socket, I had a socket extension cut off, and I put that drill, the socket on there, and I spun that rotor, because it was, and I just held a piece of 80 grit sandpaper up against the rotor to clean that rust off of it, that rusty spot. And so the service manager came walking up and says, "What in the Sam Hill are you doing?" I said, "I'm trying to, clean this rust off of here." He said, "Well, I told her she was going to have new rotors." I said, "Well, David, let's just try this and see what it does." And so anyway, we did that and it fixed it. And so when she showed up to pay the bill, it was like $20 instead of $200. And she was happy, and she always came back to us for service, you see. You don't always have to throw brand new parts on one. Now, there's nothing that was unsafe about what I was doing. I did not change the design of the brakes. I just cleaned the rust off the rotor, you see. And sometimes you can do that. Now, occasionally you're going to have a service manager who's going to say, "No, we're not going to do that. We need to go ahead." Well, you listen to the boss. You know what I'm saying? He was grumbling. He didn't tell me. He didn't give me an order. He's just griping about it. I said, "Let's just see what it does." And if it don't, if we don't like the way it feels, we'll put some rotors on there. But it so happened that it fixed it right up. But anyway, if the car pulls, what do you got? Hey, let me ask you this: if I mash the brakes and the car, I'm doing a long, gentle stop, and the car starts out pulling, let's say to the right, and the more but I'm not applying the brakes any harder. I've got the brakes on. I'm holding the wheel steady, but it stops pulling. As I hold the brake and I'm continuing to stop, it stops pulling and it starts stopping straight.
Yes. Caliper stop steady.
Well, typically that's going to be one of those flexible brake hoses that's going to be swollen on the inside.
Oh, not letting it.
Yeah, not letting the fluid go as freely to one of them as the other. Now, if you put your, these gauges I've got that you put between the rotors and the disc, that will read how much pressure each. If you see one like that, if you mash the brake and hold it, and this one comes up and then that one goes up slow, you'll know that you've got to replace that hose. Always remember that hose, and don't let your brake caliper hang on that dadgum hose. Make you an S-hook out of something. I use a brake line here lately. Just make a nice S-hook out of a brake line. Just keep that in your toolbox. That way you ain't got to dig up a coat hanger every time. And the S-hook works better anyway than a coat hanger. Because you just hook it. But sometimes it's hard to find a good place to tie that coat hanger. You got to fight with it, But or a welding rod. You can take an old stick welding rod and bust. Or even if you don't bust all the flux off of it, you can bend it into an S and use that. Of course, I like taking wire brushing the flux off of those when we use them. If you got a misaligned front end, it'll make it pull. If you got drum brake components malfunctioning, frozen caliper pistons, that kind of thing. Okay, let's go on to, question 1 was B only. Question 2, we're wanting to know which is not true about service and ABS components. Air gaps between the speed sensors and tooth string must be adjusted after you machine the brake loaders. Is that true? No, you never have to do that, so that's not true. It's going to be a C. Technician A says it's normal for the amber ABS light to light when the ABS is activated during braking. Is he right about that? Heck no. You don't ever see that. Technician B says it is normal for the red brake lamp to light when the ignition is first turned on and when the engine's off. Who's right? Is he right? Mm-hmm. We just talked about that, didn't we? When working on a vehicle with anti-lock brakes, technician A relieves the system pressure by slightly opening a bleeder screw and allowing fluid to spray into a wide mouth container. Wide mouth container. What do you think about that? Is that good? That's not good.
Right.
Huh?
He's right.
All right. So this is. Let me see. Let me make sure I'm not all wet about this. All right. All right. All right. Why would it be a wide mouth container, by the way?
It's not a lot of air going to be on
Yeah.
You need something tight. Yeah.
Well, I mean, let me ask you this. If there's pressure trapped at the brakes, is that normal?
Air pressure?
Any kind of pressure. If there's any kind of pressure trapped at the brakes, is that a good thing?
No, because the brakes compressed.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to actually have the brakes applied. So listen to what he's saying here. When working on a vehicle with anti-lock brakes, you relieve system pressure. You don't do that, you're going to pump the pedal, right? What you're going to do on that?
B.
All right. Technician B turns off the ignition switch and pumps the pedal 30 or 40 times until she feels an increase in pedal pressure. You think about that question there?
Right.
All right. Bleeding an ABS is being discussed. Technician A says cracking open the brake line connections at the hydraulic module and bleeding the air into a shop rag is recommended procedure for some systems. Cracking them open and bleed it into a shop rag?
Randy, what you doing?
Huh?
Yeah.
Shop rag.
Pressure bleed.
Shop rags are good, aren't they?
Checking out.
Yes.
Wipe my hands off.
Yeah. All right. I don't know. Of course, if you're going to do anything like that, you probably ought to put a shop rag over it. Technician B says pressure bleeding is required for bleeding ABS systems. That is not always true.
What's pressure bleeding, man?
Pressure bleeding would be using a unit that actually puts pressure in there instead of pumping the pedal. It actually pressurizes the system for you. And most shops don't have one of those, and when they do have one, most of them don't use it. I tell you, there is another cool little tool though. Like there's a vacuum chamber that you can put on there, and you can actually keep it full of fluid up front, and plug these lines on all your bleeders, and you hook your shop air up to it, and it creates low pressure in this big vacuum chamber, and it sucks all the air out of there whenever you got good clear fluid coming through all of your hoses into your. Yeah, that's pretty cool, isn't it? I mean, it's not a bad way to do it. You can also do it with one of these pump.
Like we did with my clutch at one time.
Yeah, that works some too. You know, you can do those. Basically, you're making atmospheric pressure bleed the brakes for you. So it's something else you can do on some of them. And some of your ABS systems are just have normal bleed procedures. Lawrence has got issues with his ABS on his mother's car, on that Maxima, where we were looking at the brakes, the way they were laid out, and it was left front and right rear is going through one particular channel on the ABS unit. He's getting no fluid on left front and right rear. But it's coming out of both of the lines coming from it's got two lines coming out of the brake master cylinder. Both of those are putting out really good fluid. If we broke them loose, they squirting fluid all over the place. But when it goes into that anti-lock brake unit, it's sending fluid to the right front and the left rear, but you ain't getting that to the other two. And so we got ABS. Did you ever check on a price on an ABS unit, or you just tell Mom and them they want to live with that?
I still got it at my house. She said whenever we get a little money,
Yeah, scare up an ABS unit on that. And we've had to replace them, before for stuff like that. All right, now then. As the pressure bleeding is not required for all ABSs. I mean, it's just not. A lot of them you can bleed. Now, on some of these Chevys, on some of the Fords, on some of the Fords, you got to plug the scan tool in and run a pump in the ABS unit. On some of the Chevys, you got to mash some little buttons on the ABS unit and hold them. They got a tool for that while you're bleeding them. If you don't do that, you won't ever get them bled. Some ABS units have got bleeder screws on the ABS unit. And so there's all kinds of stuff you got to consider when you're bleeding ABS. It always feels good to just be able to just go ahead and bleed it normally, and a lot of times you can get away with that. But if you ever run into one, see, Lawrence had a problem with his ABS unit. It wasn't because you weren't bleeding it right; it's because you had a problem. You insert that big ABS unit in there, you're going to insert potential other problems that aren't easy to solve without replacing a piece if it's bad. All right, we're on 6 now. We're
5 was neither, right?
Yeah, 5 neither. I don't like either one of them guys. The thing is, see, these guys right here are talking like there's a standard thing you have to do when you're bleeding all of the ABS systems, and that's just not so. When removing a vehicle's ABS electronic control module, let's see, Technician A relieves hydraulic pressure in the system. This is the electronic control module now. Technician B disconnects the battery ground cable. Who's right about that?
And that's right.
And that going to be a B?
That's what you have to do.
That's going to be a B, isn't it? All right, you got like that? Now we're coming down here when first testing a car with ABS, it's important to connect the battery, to disconnect the battery ground negative cable. Technician B was the one that was right on that last one, by the way, in case you hadn't figured it out. When you're testing a car with ABS, it's important to disconnect the battery ground cable, apply the parking brake, note the status of the ABS warning lamp, and try to lock the brakes. Wait a minute, when first testing the car with ABS.
Oh yeah, note the status of the ABS warning light.
Yeah. Note the status of the ABS warning light, yeah. I mean, what they say, try to lock the brakes. Is that when you're going to drive down the road and slam on the brake tip and slide?
Oh,
All right. When inspecting wheel speed sensors, you check for all of the following except A, correct bias voltage, B, proper contact between the pole piece and tone ring, C, secure sensor mounting, or D, condition of the tone ring teeth. Now, let me tell you something about this. This particular handout talks about bias voltage, and whatever car that was that these people were working on and had been really familiar with, whoever wrote this, was that you could measure with the voltmeter and you would see some voltage going down the line going through the sensor. And not all cars send a bias voltage down there. They just don't, I mean, now you are going to see 12 volts, like on these Dodge Caravans. It's got those MRE sensors on them. You're going to see 12 volts going down there, and that 12 volts is going to actually change a little bit when you're turning it. But most of these, like on this Oldsmobile out here, if you go out there and you're looking for bias voltage on that Oldsmobile, you're subject not to see it. That doesn't mean anything, really. But you remember your computers, though, they like to send out a little voltage and see if it comes back to make sure all of the components, like all your solenoids and sensors, have got a closed loop. But you can't count on that on every ABS system. So these people, what they're saying, the right one on that one, is proper contact between the pole piece and tone ring is not anything you're looking for. You don't want those things. Well, the pole piece is sometimes what they call the like a stator in a distributor, or the anti-lock brake sensor. It's got a magnet with the wire wrapped around it. That's what they call a pole piece, But that's not anything. You don't want them to make contact. These variable reluctance sensors, like what you have with the magnet with the wire wrapped around, Delphi makes those, and some other manufacturers do, and they can put out as much as 400 volts. Those things, you don't usually see that. It depends on how fast your tone ring's spinning and how that thing's spec'd out and all. But as a matter of fact, when I wrote that article about speed sensors, the technical editor of the magazine sent me, he said, "Are you sure this is right?" about these things able to put out 400 volts. And I pulled up the Delphi product information on the VRF sensors. It was a PDF document that I had downloaded from Delphi, and I emailed it to him, and there it said, in plain as day, up to 400 volts in VRF sensors can put out. But they use them in all kinds of industry. They don't just use them in cars, you know.
Yeah.
But you don't really need 400 volts on that, you know. I mean,
Kill somebody almost, wouldn't
yeah, you could, if they had their tongue stuck to it, it might, I guess. But, all right.
Child will usually
Yeah.
test them.
Well, you know the.
Minis burn.
You know, have you ever been holding on to fooling around with the points in a distributor?
I've never messed with any.
And and what happens is if somebody's moving the engine a little bit, those points are opening and closing. When you're touching them like that, it'll shock you. And my boss man one time was working on we were working on an old Rambler. Heck, I was about 19 or 20, I guess. And he says, "Come on over here." And it was real hot that day. And he says, "Let's see if we can." I was supposed to do something on one side of the engine compartment. He was supposed to do something on the other. And we were working on two different things, under the hood, out there in the heat, you know. And he was fooling around in the distributor. And every time I moved the engine a little bit, it would move the rotor a little bit, and it would, you know, operate the points some kind of way. I don't remember how it was happening, but anyway, he says, "You're eating me up over here," because it was shocking him. But that was about 400 volts. It was, I mean, believe it or not, well, what does the coil put out? You know, the coil puts out 100,000 volts. You know, so you're basically getting bit a little bit by that little kick that's coming out of there. But there's not enough amperage there to do anything except make you uncomfortable. How many of you have tasted of a battery to see if it was a good charge on it? You can do that with these little button batteries that are about the size of a nickel. That's a nickel. I thought it was a button battery. I saw it laying in the dark, and I couldn't figure it out. Wave it in front of you. But yeah, you can touch those with your tongue and see if they're tinkle your tongue a little. They got some juice in them. But they're just 3 volts. You know. Yeah. But anyway, let's look at here. Technician A, we're on question number 9 now. Technician A says, in some anti-lock systems, the power brake assist is provided by pressurized brake fluid supplied by the hydraulic accumulator. He's right. We've been talking about that. And this thing is typically, if you look from the top, and I need to find a picture of one of those because I actually took one. You kind of look from the top, you're basically going to see your brake fluid reservoir, and over here to the side, on the ones that I'm thinking about, with a sort of a wrench flat on it, you're going to see something that looks big and round like that. Now, if you looked at it from another angle, not from the top, if you looked at it from the side, which is very difficult to see sometimes, you'd actually see it, and it looks kind of like that. Yeah, but it's got wrench flats on top, so you screw it out. Now, what you don't want to do is screw it out of there without disengaging the pump. If you disconnect the battery, the hydraulic pump, the ABS pump that pressures this up, is not going to work. Inside this is a diaphragm, and actually it's like this. And inside that, and above that diaphragm is a couple of 1,000 pounds of nitrogen gas pressure. And what happens is the ABS pump pumps it up, and it makes that diaphragm go like this against that nitrogen gas pressure, and that's what's giving you your power assist on some of those older systems. And if you take that thing and you happen to screw this out of there, this big bulb-looking thing, it's gonna take off like a rocket, probably knock your head clean off. You know, it's just not good to do that. But anyway, Technician B says the accumulator holds highly pressurized nitrogen gas used for power brake boost. What I just got through saying. That's a buffum. All right. Technician A says wheel speed sensors generate a square wave frequency signal. Now this is old. This is an old piece of work right here that we're working off of. Like I was telling you a while ago, the Dodge van does that. Now what you can do, if you want to see, like somebody says, you cannot check these wheel speed sensors on these Dodge vans and some of the Toyotas. I'll show you what the Toyotas do. They got these MRE units in there, and they can, believe it or not, as crazy as that sounds, the Toyota brakes on the newer ones can tell you if the wheels are moving forward or backwards.
Really?
Yeah. And if I took my little scope, my little Celerity scope out here, and what they want you to do, the people, if you talk to the people,
the wave backwards, wouldn't it?
huh?
It do make the wave go backwards.
No, they don't do that. It's a square wave. And what you do, like I took my little polarity scope out there, and instead of hooking it up, what they're wanting is if you got your sensor right here, and it's got two wires coming out of it, and they're going through a connector, and they're going, they got a, male, female connector, and this is going to the unit right here.
Right.
Right, you got that? You draw that a little lower on the board or something. I might have to give me some more markers because I'm wearing these out. All right, here's your sensor, and here's your ring. It's going past it. And I ain't worth the tooth at drawing that ring because it's got to be more regular than that. All right, the ring's going past it, and you got these two wires going out. Now this is one that does have a voltage going to it. And what it's got is it's got 12 volts here, and it's got ground here. All right. Now on that 12 volt line, if you were to disengage this from the connector, and you were to hook up in between there with your little amp measuring meter, you can actually see, if you turn it slow, you can see the 7 to 14 milliamps is what you're going to see there. But what's so cool about that is, and my buddy Donnie Hughes was telling me about this, he says, they told us at Chrysler to measure to measure the amps, the milliamps, and watch it switch on and off. It's a square wave signal. He said, I figured, I reasoned, I said, why don't I just take and hook a meter, and I did this the other day. I used a paper clip, didn't hurt the sensor or nothing. It's up there in you got to pull that boot out of the body and pull it down so you can get to the connector. And the one that's the 12 volt, on the 12 volt wire, you back probe that with a paper clip, and between there and ground, you're going to measure it with your scope, and you will see a square wave when you're turning that sucker, even though you're only measuring voltage. It's like 7 to 14 millivolts. So you can tell if the sensor's working or not.
Right.
Now you're not going to have a very big square wave coming out of that darn thing, but you can measure it, and most people don't know that. Unless they've read my wheel speed sensors article in last month's issue of Motor Age. Okay, and because I showed it on a little screen, you can do that. For a lot of people, even the technical editors says, man, I didn't know you could do that. But see, I can't take credit for discovering it. Donnie was the one that was talking about it. He said, I figured, and you can take a meter, just a plain old handheld meter, put it on that 12 volt side, hook it up to ground, and turn the wheel real slow. If you turn the wheel fast, you won't see nothing. Turn the wheel real slow, you'll see it going up and down. And it won't be a lot.
You're not talking about, you'll see the voltage fluctuate?
Yeah, you'll see the voltage on your little digital meter go up. And if you had a needle with a needle, nobody has a meter with a needle anymore. Because a lot of times them needle meters are going to, pull enough current where it's going to screw things up. So you need a really high impedance meter. But this is something you cannot do with a test light. Okay, so what I'm getting at is you want to make darn sure that you got something that's measurable and not observable. But see, what they're saying here is the answer they're wanting. All of the wheel speed sensors, when they wrote this handout, were putting out these analog signals like that. They don't all do that anymore. Now, let me tell you what happens on the Toyota. I meant to tell you that too. On the Toyota, when you're going forward, the signal, if you scope it, looks like this, right?
Right.
When you're going backwards, the signal looks like this. If it sees that, because it's got two MREs in there, and the one that energizes first is going to, start out, then it's going to short some of that away, but not all of it. But I mean, when you're going backwards, it looks like that. When you're going forward, it looks like that. Is that cool or what?
Yeah.
I mean, so backwards, it looks like the little castle head whenever you're going backwards on your scope and all that. So most folks don't know that either. So you guys are, that's why you're in school, right? So you can learn stuff most folks don't know. Now there's some stuff other folk know that you don't, but there's also stuff you know that they don't, so that gives you a little bit of an equal. Okay, so on that one right there, the answer that the answer the key is going to want on that, it does have a permanent magnet, and
So it's B?
it's going to be B only on if that's the answer that the test is going to want. All right, you happy with that?